Have you ever wondered why, in the moments after passion, a man who once seemed inseparably close suddenly drifts into distance, silent, detached, as though he has stepped into another world entirely? Most women assume this distance means he has lost interest, but the truth is far more paradoxical. What you think secures his affection can be the very thing that erodes it. Carl Jung believed that intimacy awakens not only the body but the unconscious, and what is spoken in those vulnerable instants can either nourish the bond or awaken his deepest fears of entrapment. In those moments when the body softens and the soul briefly opens, words become more than words. They act as archetypal keys, stirring shadows long buried in his psyche. The masculine, though it craves union, is also shaped by a primal need for autonomy, for the preservation of self. After sex, a man's unconscious enters a state of heightened sensitivity, a liminal threshold where he teeters between closeness and retreat. It is here that certain phrases, seemingly innocent, touch the nerve of his fear, reminding him of bonds that smother rather than liberate. And when that happens, he doesn't consciously choose to pull away, his very psyche compels him to. The feminine must understand this subtle dance. For her, the act often deepens connection, weaving the threads of trust and emotional intimacy. For him, paradoxically, the same act can awaken an unconscious reflex to reclaim himself from the abyss of fusion. This does not mean he does not care. It means his archetypal wiring demands that his ego reasserts itself. To mistake this for rejection is to misunderstand the nature of masculine energy. To speak the wrong words in this threshold moment is to push against his unspoken fears, and those fears, once stirred, create distance that can feel unbridgeable. Imagine whispering words that bind too tightly, that imply permanence where he seeks freedom. Words about the future that he has not yet imagined for himself. Questions about what the act means, spoken not from curiosity but from a hunger for reassurance. In the language of Jung, such words project the feminine's shadow, the fear of abandonment, the need for validation, onto him. He feels her unconscious weight pressing upon him, not her love. And so, he retreats, not because of her essence, but because of the projection placed upon him. This is where the art lies. To understand that after sex, silence is not absence, it is integration. He is folding back into himself, balancing the surge of intimacy with the restoration of his solitary core. If she can hold that space without rushing to fill it, she becomes the woman who does not chase, but who trusts the magnetic current between them. Yet if she fills it with the wrong words, pleas, ultimatums, confessions too early, she awakens not his devotion, but his defenses. The paradox is cruel but clear. The moments when you feel most open are the very moments when he is most fragile. What you say may echo far longer than you realize. And while your intent may be tenderness, his reception may be suffocation. To understand this is to step into a deeper wisdom of relationship dynamics, one that bridges ancient archetypes and modern psychology. So listen closely, because what follows is not about manipulation, but mastery of self-awareness. It is about the feminine reclaiming her power, learning not to hand her worth to him through careless words. It is about seeing that what truly draws a man near is not desperate affirmation but the mystery of a woman rooted in her own center. This is not silence born of fear, it is silence woven from strength. It is choosing words as carefully as one would wield fire, because after sex, words either warm the bond or burn it to ash. In the hushed aftermath, when breath steadies and the body unwinds from its fever, the man's psyche slips into a twilight zone of instinct and defense. The masculine principle, as Jung would frame it, lives always with the paradox of intimacy. To merge is to risk losing the self. And so, while the feminine feels a natural pull toward weaving closeness with words, the masculine often withdraws, not in rejection, but in self-preservation. Here is where so many women stumble, mistaking his quiet retreat for coldness, and rushing to fill the silence with phrases that unknowingly scratch at his deepest wounds. The first shadowed phrase is the premature demand for definition. "So, what are we now?" whispered against the remnants of passion, becomes not a sweet inquiry but a chain. To his unconscious, such a question is not about clarity but about possession. The act of asking too soon stirs the archetype of the devouring mother, an energy he instinctively resists. It tells him he is no longer free to move through his own rhythm of becoming. And even if he has genuine feelings, he recoils, for the question suggests that his worth is only measured by the role he is willing to name. Another phrase drips with a subtle poison: "Do you really love me?" At the height of vulnerability, this plea becomes an echo of abandonment wounds. Instead of deepening connection, it projects the feminine's fear outward, asking him to carry a weight that is not his. Jung taught that the shadow seeks to be seen, and here the shadow is the terror of not being enough, of being left unchosen. The man does not hear the words as an invitation to affirm, he hears them as a demand, a grasping hand tugging at his freedom. And so he begins to withdraw, not from lack of love, but from the heaviness of being forced into the role of savior. The third phrase is deceptively gentle: "You're the only one I could ever be with." Though it sounds like devotion, to the masculine it resonates with the archetype of entrapment. It signals to him that his presence is not chosen each day, but trapped in inevitability. The unconscious mind reads this not as romance but as captivity. He feels the walls closing in, as though the door to freedom is slowly being locked. This is why some men, after hearing such declarations, grow restless. It is not that they do not value love, it is that love becomes conflated with ownership, and the soul resists enslavement. Each of these phrases, though born from longing, act like mirrors of unintegrated shadow. They reveal the feminine's own battle with fear, fear of loss, fear of rejection, fear of being unseen. And when fear speaks, it rarely breeds intimacy. Instead, it awakens the man's own shadow, the fear of being consumed, of losing his sovereignty. Two shadows collide, and instead of union, the space fills with unspoken tension. But the woman who learns to recognize this dance discovers her power. She understands that silence is not emptiness, it is the crucible where desire is renewed. She does not rush to cage the bond with words. She knows that love that needs constant reassurance is not yet love but dependency. To embody this truth is to stand in quiet strength, to let him return to himself without panic, and to allow her own worth to radiate without demanding proof. For when she refrains from these shadowed phrases, something remarkable happens. His unconscious begins to feel safe. Safe to return, safe to remain, safe to invest deeper. And paradoxically, the less she clings, the more he chooses to draw near, not out of There is another phrase, spoken often with casualness yet felt like a blade to the masculine unconscious: "You complete me." At first glance, it appears drenched in romance, echoing cultural tales of soulmates and eternal halves seeking union. But beneath this sentiment lies a hidden trap. To the man who has just given of his body and spirit in intimacy, these words whisper of obligation. They tell him he must be more than himself, he must be her missing piece, the carrier of her wholeness. And in that moment, instead of basking in connection, he feels the crushing weight of becoming her savior. Jung would say this is projection in its most seductive form. She has handed him her anima, her inner source of completeness, and demanded he animate it for her. Such projection eventually collapses, because no man can sustain being the vessel of another's unfinished soul. There is also the subtle dagger of comparison: "You're so much better than the others." Intended as praise, it nonetheless awakens suspicion in his unconscious. It paints intimacy not as a unique bond but as a ranking in a hidden competition. The archetype of the trickster stirs in him, whispering that love here may not be about truth, but about performance. Instead of feeling chosen for who he is, he feels tested against ghosts of lovers past. In this way, the compliment becomes poison. It roots his presence not in the sacredness of now but in the shadow of those who came before. And in that shadow, trust begins to wither. Then there is the fatal phrase, one that pierces his need for freedom at its core: promise me you'll never leave. This is not merely a request, it is a contract spoken under the veil of vulnerability, a vow demanded in the most fragile of states. To him, it signals not devotion but desperation. It places the weight of her survival on his shoulders. Even if he loves deeply, his psyche recoils, for the masculine is wired to flee what feels like a cage. Jung spoke of individuation as the path of becoming whole. When she demands such promises, she signals that she has not yet walked that path. She seeks wholeness through him rather than within herself. And so, he withdraws, not because he does not care, but because her words have told him she cannot stand in her own sovereignty. Each of these phrases shares a common thread: they are born from the feminine shadow, the part of her that believes she is not enough without external validation. When she speaks them, she hands the man her power. She says, in essence, you decide if I am lovable, if I am safe, if I am whole. And no man, no matter how devoted, can carry this burden without feeling suffocated. Yet the feminine who learns restraint discovers that her silence speaks louder than desperate words. She becomes mystery, a presence he longs to understand rather than a weight he longs to escape. She does not ask him to complete her, because she radiates her own completeness. She does not bind him with promises, because she trusts the bond is chosen freely. She does not compare him to others, because she sees him as singular. And in that stance of self-possession, she awakens not his fear, but his devotion. It is a paradox of attraction: the more she demands, the less he gives; the more she embodies her own wholeness, the more he offers willingly. In this paradox lives the quiet power of a woman who refuses to betray herself through careless words. She does not ask to be completed, for she is already whole. She does not ask to be saved, for she already carries the fire of her own salvation. And it is, the aftermath of intimacy is a mirror, reflecting not just the passions shared but the hidden patterns within each soul. A man's silence, so often misinterpreted as disinterest, is in truth the echo of his unconscious balancing itself. His psyche whispers, protect autonomy, preserve selfhood. And yet, when careless words slip into that fragile silence, they can awaken archetypes that turn warmth into withdrawal. What the feminine speaks here carries the gravity of myth: it either breathes life into the connection or stirs the shadows that corrode it. Consider the phrase uttered with seemingly innocent curiosity: where do you see this going? To her, it is an attempt to bridge uncertainty, to touch the security of vision. To him, in that moment of vulnerability, it feels like a demand for foresight, an interrogation at the very threshold of his re-entry into solitude. The masculine unconscious is not wired to map the future in the moments after merging, it is wired to reclaim sovereignty. This question awakens not his commitment, but his defenses. It calls forth the archetype of the warrior who must guard his freedom, even against love. And so, instead of stepping closer, he retreats, seeking refuge in silence. Then there is the phrase often spoken with softness, yet loaded with unseen weight: tell me you'll always feel this way. What seems like a plea for reassurance is actually a contract against change, a denial of the impermanence that defines human experience. The masculine spirit, sensitive to authenticity, hears this as an impossible vow. He senses that she does not crave truth but illusion. Jung would remind us that the psyche rebels against false promises, for the unconscious knows what the ego tries to deny, that feelings evolve, that seasons shift. By demanding permanence in the midst of flux, she inadvertently signals that she fears reality more than she embraces it. To him, that fear is suffocating, a whisper that love here is conditional on eternal performance. And there is the most insidious phrase, one that emerges when fear has fully claimed the feminine shadow: I don't know what I'd do without you. It seems tender, even flattering, but beneath it lies dependency masquerading as devotion. To the masculine unconscious, these words ring with alarm. They tell him he is not simply loved, he is needed to the point of erasing her own sovereignty. The archetype of the rescuer may stir briefly within him, but soon after comes resentment, for no man desires to carry the burden of another's existence. The psyche, sensing the weight of that responsibility, drives him to distance himself before he is consumed. Each of these phrases, though clothed in longing, betray the woman's unclaimed wholeness. They reveal the wound of abandonment, the shadow of unworthiness, the hunger to anchor love through words rather than presence. And when these wounds speak, the man's own shadow rises to meet them. His fear of losing self collides with her fear of losing him, and the union that could have deepened collapses into a quiet estrangement. But the woman who has walked the path of inner work knows a different way. She does not seek to bind him with words but allows the silence to breathe. She recognizes that intimacy is not sustained by constant affirmation but by trust in her own magnetism. She embodies what Jung called individuation, the becoming of a whole being, no longer seeking her reflection in another's eyes but in the depths of her own. In this stance, she transforms the very atmosphere of the aftermath. Instead of words that cling, she radiates presence that liberates. And paradoxically, it is this freedom she grants that draws him back to her, not as a prisoner of her fears, but as a willing. What lingers unspoken after the merging of bodies is often louder than the words themselves. The masculine silence, which so many women interpret as detachment, is not absence but recalibration. It is the psyche reorganizing, reclaiming boundaries after being momentarily dissolved in passion. To pierce that silence with the wrong words is to disturb a delicate alchemy, to pour fear into a vessel that is still settling. In this liminal space, phrases become spells, either weaving deeper trust or fracturing it. One such phrase is the subtle attempt at possession cloaked in jest: now you're mine. It may slip from the lips with laughter, yet his unconscious does not hear playfulness. It hears the archetype of ensnarement, the whisper that his freedom has been signed away. For the masculine spirit, whose deepest instinct is movement and choice, this joking claim feels like a chain. Even if he smiles outwardly, inwardly he stiffens, sensing the tightening of invisible bonds. Jung reminds us that what is spoken in jest often springs from the shadow. Here, it is the shadow's fear of abandonment, disguised as humor. Another phrase, dripping with vulnerability but laced with poison, is, "Don't ever change." She means to praise the moment, to preserve the beauty of what she sees before her. Yet unconsciously, she demands stasis in a world defined by flux. The masculine archetype of the seeker bristles, for to him, growth is survival. To ask him not to change is to ask him to betray his nature, to remain frozen in a version of himself that exists only to soothe her. What begins as flattery transforms into a subtle rejection of his unfolding self. And so, instead of leaning deeper into her embrace, he begins to pull away, sensing that his future evolution may not be welcomed. There is also the phrase of disguised self-erasure: "You make me feel like I finally have a reason to live." Though wrapped in the silk of devotion, its core is heavy with despair. To him, it signals that her existence is tethered to his presence. The unconscious reads this not as romance but as burden. He becomes the sun she orbits, the singular source of her light. And with that weight comes dread, for no man can bear the responsibility of being another's sole reason for existence. This phrase awakens the archetype of the prisoner within him, whispering that her love is not freedom but dependency, and the urge to flee grows stronger with each heartbeat. Each of these utterances arises from the feminine shadow, the part of her that does not yet know her own completeness. They are not confessions of love, but cries for rescue disguised as affection. When she speaks them, she unconsciously betrays herself, handing him the keys to her worth. And though he may not articulate it, his spirit senses the imbalance, recoiling not from her body, but from the unspoken demand that he must carry her soul. Yet the woman who understands this dance refrains. She embodies restraint not as silence born of fear, but as silence born of power. Her presence alone communicates more than frantic words ever could. She does not claim ownership, because she trusts in the magnetic current between them. She does not demand permanence, because she is grounded in her own evolution. She does not project her survival upon him, because she knows she is already whole. And in that wholeness, she becomes not a weight, but a mystery, an invitation he longs to approach again and again. In this way, she steps into her archetypal power. She ceases to speak from shadow and begins to radiate from essence. And when she does, his withdrawal transforms not into escape, but into return, drawn back not by demand, but by desire. For nothing is more magnetic to the masculine than a woman who holds her own center. There is a moment after intimacy where the body rests, but the psyche remains raw, unguarded, open, and tender. It is in this liminal state that words carry disproportionate power. They do not land as mere syllables, they carve into the unconscious, shaping how the masculine remembers not only her, but the experience of union itself. And when certain phrases emerge, they awaken in him ancient reflexes, archetypal fears that whisper, "Escape before you are consumed." Consider the phrase often disguised as playful curiosity, "Was I better than the others?" To the feminine, it may seem light-hearted, even flirtatious. But to the masculine, it becomes a test laced with danger. He does not hear a question, he hears a trap. Whatever answer he gives, it cannot satisfy, for the very act of comparison diminishes the sacredness of the moment. Instead of lingering in the wholeness of now, the bond collapses into rivalry with phantoms of the past. Jung spoke of the shadow as the repository of all that is repressed, and here, her shadow of insecurity speaks louder than her essence. What she seeks is reassurance, but what he feels is unease. The experience of passion becomes tainted by judgment, and his instinct is to retreat. Another phrase cuts in a subtler way, "I can't live without you." Though it may sound like the height of romance, its energy is heavy, suffocating. It tells him he is no longer a partner, but a lifeline. Instead of being chosen freely, he becomes indispensable, bound to sustain her very existence. This awakens the archetype of the captive within his unconscious, and with it, the urgent need to break free. The masculine spirit, which thrives on voluntary devotion, recoils from devotion that is demanded as necessity. And so, even in love, he begins to feel trapped, for no man can hold the weight of another's entire survival without losing himself. Then there is the phrase spoken in jest yet laced with possession, "Now you're stuck with me forever." At the level of ego, it may sound humorous. But at the level of the unconscious, it suggests inevitability rather than choice. The masculine recoils at the idea of permanence imposed, of fate scripted without freedom. The archetype of the wanderer stirs, reminding him that love must always remain an act of will, not coercion. And though he may laugh, deep within, the seed of withdrawal is planted. He senses not partnership, but entrapment, and instinctively begins to guard his space. All of these phrases share one essence: they do not honor the sacred balance between intimacy and autonomy. They speak from fear, not from power. They betray a hunger for security so deep that it eclipses the mystery of love itself. And when fear replaces mystery, attraction wanes. For no man falls in love with desperation, he falls in love with the radiance of a woman who does not need him to survive, but who chooses him because her soul is already whole. The feminine who understands this truth begins to weave silence not as absence, but as presence. She refrains from asking questions that test, from making declarations that bind, from speaking fears disguised as love. Instead, she rests in her own completeness, allowing the air after intimacy to thrum with quiet magnetism. In that stillness, he feels safe, not demanded, not trapped, not compared. Safe to return, safe to stay, safe to fall deeper. For it is not the words that bind him, but the space she holds. Not the questions she asks, but the mystery she embodies. Not the reassurance she seeks, but the certainty she radiates. The silence after intimacy is sacred, yet fragile. It is here, in this liminal chamber of rawness, that the unconscious listens most acutely. Words spoken in this interval penetrate deeper than they would at any other time. They slip past the guard of reason and land in the marrow of his psyche, where archetypes stir and shadows awaken. The man may not remember the exact phrase days later, but he will remember the feeling it gave him. And feelings, not logic, are what compel him to stay or to vanish. One of the most dangerous phrases, often cloaked in vulnerability, is, "You make me feel like I finally matter." Though tender on the surface, it tells him he has become the sole arbiter of her worth. This awakens in him not pride but dread. He hears in it the archetype of the savior, chained to her self-perception, responsible now for maintaining her sense of meaning. The masculine spirit, which thrives on being chosen freely, recoils at being burdened with the duty of validating another's existence. Jung would say this is anima projection in its purest form. She has cast her unlived value onto him, demanding he hold what she has not yet claimed within herself. The weight of such a role is crushing, and his unconscious whispers to him the only escape: distance. Another phrase, spoken with the urgency of possession, is, "Promise me you'll never hurt me." To the feminine, it may feel like a plea for safety, but to him it is an impossible vow. The masculine unconscious knows that hurt is inevitable in love, that to merge is to risk wounds. By demanding a promise against pain, she signals not trust but fear, not surrender but control. He feels not embraced, but bound by conditions he cannot fulfill. The archetype of the trickster is awakened in him here, for he senses the futility of such a promise, and rather than deepen the bond, he looks for a way out, instinctively protecting himself from the punishment that would come when the inevitable imperfection arises. There is also the phrase that reeks of comparison disguised as flattery: "You're nothing like my ex." Though she intends it as praise, his unconscious hears only the invocation of another man, a ghost intruding into the sacred space of now. Instead of feeling unique, he feels measured, defined in contrast rather than in essence. The archetype of the rival emerges in his psyche, pulling him out of intimacy and into competition with a phantom. Attraction cannot breathe in the presence of such specters. Instead of union, he feels suspicion, wondering when he too will be placed on the scale of judgment. These phrases, though diverse in form, share the same origin: the feminine shadow's cry for security, reassurance, and anchoring. They are born not from her radiance but from her wound. And when wounds speak louder than essence, the man's unconscious retreats. Not because he does not desire her, but because he cannot thrive under the weight of her projections. Yet the woman who has integrated her shadow understands that she does not need to speak from fear. She does not place her worth in his hands, nor bind him with vows he cannot keep, nor summon the ghosts of lovers past to haunt the present. Instead, she breathes in the silence, embodying trust in her own magnetism. She knows she matters with or without him. She knows hurt is a risk worth bearing. She knows he is not her ex, but a sovereign soul she chooses freely. And in this stance, she becomes untouchable, not because she withholds, but because she radiates completeness. It is in this very completeness that the paradox unfolds: the less she grasps, the more he reaches; the less she demands, the more he devotes; the less she fears, the more he feels safe to remain. This is not manipulation, there is a truth few dare to admit: intimacy does not end when the bodies part. It lingers in the air like incense, fragile, invisible, and easily shattered. In this liminal state, when desire has melted into stillness, the unconscious is listening more keenly than at any other time. What the woman utters here can either become an elixir that deepens trust or a poison that awakens his instinct to flee. And though the phrases seem small, their impact is vast, for in this moment, she speaks not just to his ears, but to the archetypes dwelling in his shadow. One phrase, heavy with hidden claws, is, "You'll never find anyone like me." At first, it sounds like confidence, even seduction. Yet beneath it lies an unspoken threat: scarcity as leverage. His unconscious does not hear admiration of her uniqueness, it hears manipulation, a veiled attempt to tether him through fear of loss. The archetype of the rebel stirs within him, whispering that he must resist being coerced into devotion. What she intended as empowerment is received as control, and the flame of attraction flickers under the shadow of demand. Another phrase, born from insecurity yet cloaked as curiosity, is, "Did you mean everything you said tonight?" It seems innocent, a plea for clarity. But to the masculine, it signals doubt, an inability to trust the authenticity of the moment. His unconscious, still tender from vulnerability, interprets the question as suspicion. The archetype of the judge awakens within him, he feels weighed, evaluated, mistrusted. Instead of resting in the sweetness of shared passion, he is forced into defense. And the more he senses he must prove himself, the more he longs for distance where proof is no longer demanded. Then there is the phrase that binds with invisible chains: "Don't ever forget me." To the feminine, it is a cry for permanence in a world of impermanence. To the masculine, it becomes a spell of attachment, a refusal to allow the moment to breathe on its own terms. His unconscious recoils, for it knows that love cannot be forced into eternity by decree. The archetype of the wanderer within him begins to stir, sensing that freedom is under siege. Instead of drawing him deeper, this plea drives him toward withdrawal, not because he wishes to forget, but because he resists being commanded to remember. All of these words share one thread: they arise not from her essence, but from her wound. They are the shadow's voice, trembling with fear of loss, craving reassurance, attempting to bind what can only be chosen. Jung would remind us that projection is the thief of intimacy. When she places her insecurity into his hands, she unknowingly makes him responsible for battles that are hers to fight. And the masculine, though capable of devotion, resists being made custodian of another's shadow. But the woman who embodies her wholeness knows a deeper secret: silence is not weakness, it is power. She does not say, "You'll never find another like me." She knows her uniqueness requires no defense. She does not demand he confirm his words, she trusts in her own ability to discern truth from illusion. She does not beg to be remembered, she understands that what is unforgettable needs no reminder. In this way, she becomes not a weight pressing upon him, but a mystery he cannot help but circle back to. The paradox is timeless: what she releases returns, what she clings to slips away. The feminine who understands this holds her power not in what she demands after passion, but in what she withholds. She refrains from words that grasp, because her soul is already anchored. And it is this anchoring, this rare balance of openness and sovereignty, that calls the masculine back, not as a prisoner, but as a willing devotee. Every union of bodies opens a doorway between worlds, the physical dissolves into the archetypal, the ego into the unconscious. Yet it is in the aftermath, when breath slows and stillness blankets the room, that the real test of intimacy begins. Here, the masculine psyche becomes exquisitely sensitive. His energy contracts inward, reclaiming the self that has just merged. If in this threshold moment she speaks words shaped by fear, they pierce him deeper than she realizes. What is whispered then does not vanish with the night, it lodges in memory, weaving itself into the story his unconscious tells about her. A phrase that often arises here is, "Don't leave me like the others did." It seems a plea for reassurance, but to the masculine it sounds like a prophecy of failure. He hears not love, but mistrust, an assumption that he will wound her in the same way she has already been wounded. The archetype of the betrayer awakens in his unconscious, projected onto him before he has even acted. In that instant, he feels punished for sins he has not committed. Instead of drawing closer to prove himself, he instinctively withdraws, for no man wishes to live under a verdict already written in fear. Another phrase draped in vulnerability but rooted in shadow is, "You're the only reason I'm happy." Though spoken as devotion, its weight is unbearable. To his unconscious, it declares that her joy is contingent, conditional, utterly dependent upon him. The archetype of the rescuer stirs within him, but quickly turns to exhaustion, for he senses that if her happiness collapses, it will be his failure. Jung would say this is a fusion of shadows, her unclaimed wholeness is thrust upon him, demanding he sustain it. And the masculine psyche, so attuned to freedom, begins to long for air, for space, for escape from the burden of being her sole source of light. There is also the phrase of quiet surveillance, "You'll tell me if you ever stop wanting me, right?" At first, it appears as openness, but beneath it lies control. It places him in a constant state of performance, responsible not only for his feelings but for reporting their every shift. The unconscious hears this not as trust but as anticipation of abandonment. It awakens the archetype of the fugitive in him, whispering that departure would be safer than living under such scrutiny. What she seeks is certainty, but what he feels is entrapment. All these words spring from one root, the fear of losing love. And yet, in trying to guard against loss, she plants the very seeds of it. For the masculine cannot remain where he feels bound by her wounds. He desires closeness, yes, but closeness chosen, not closeness demanded. And when she reveals through her words that she cannot stand sovereign in her own being, he unconsciously steps back, not out of malice, but out of the deep human need to preserve the self. The feminine who has walked her path of inner work knows this truth. She does not voice her fears in the aftermath of union. She does not hand her wounds to him, asking him to heal what is hers to integrate. Instead, she sits in silence, her presence steady, her energy whole. She knows that her joy is her own creation, that her worth is not borrowed from his devotion. She trusts that if he stays, it is because he chooses, not because he has been bound by her fear. This restraint is not suppression, it is sovereignty. It is the embodiment of Jung's individuation, the journey toward being whole unto oneself. And in this stance, she becomes magnetic, not because she clings, but because she radiates freedom. The masculine does not flee such a woman. He returns to her, again and again, for she offers what is rare. In the quiet after passion, when bodies glisten with warmth and the air feels thick with the residue of merging, a truth emerges that most never name: intimacy is not just physical, it is psychological alchemy. What is spoken in this space does not land on the surface, it penetrates to the deepest strata of the unconscious. The masculine, so open yet so fragile here, listens with archetypal ears. Words become symbols, and symbols become verdicts. A single phrase can either seed devotion or awaken the instinct to withdraw. One of the most destructive phrases is this: "You'd never survive without me." Spoken perhaps with playfulness or ego, it strikes him like a dagger. His unconscious hears not confidence, but domination. It awakens the archetype of the tyrant, not within him, but projected onto her. Suddenly, she is no longer the beloved but the captor. Instead of intimacy, he feels humiliation, for the masculine essence is built upon sovereignty. To suggest he cannot exist without her is to strip him of his dignity. The instinctive response is distance, for no man stays where his strength is mocked, even beneath the veil of jest. Another phrase carries a subtler poison: "I know you'll get tired of me one day." It cloaks itself in vulnerability, as though to invite comfort, yet what it births is suspicion. His unconscious hears prophecy, not fear. Jung would say that what we project outward often compels reality to follow. By voicing this, she anchors doubt into the bond, summoning an inevitability that did not yet exist. Instead of reassuring her, he feels burdened by her mistrust. The archetype of the prophet of doom hovers over them both, and intimacy becomes tinged with the anticipation of its collapse. And then there is the phrase meant to cement permanence: "You're mine forever." While the feminine may see this as devotion, his unconscious hears ownership. The archetype of the wanderer stirs violently, whispering that he must preserve his right to choose. For the masculine spirit does not thrive in inevitability, it thrives in voluntary return. To claim him as property, even in love, is to trespass on the sacred ground of his autonomy. He may not argue, he may even smile, but within, a subtle wall rises. For the unconscious knows what the conscious denies: ownership kills desire, while freedom fuels it. Each of these phrases, though different, grows from the same soil: fear dressed as love. Fear of abandonment, fear of change, fear of not being enough. They are not the voice of her essence but the tremor of her shadow. When she speaks them, she hands him the script of her insecurity, demanding he play roles that no man can sustain: savior, prisoner, possession. And though he may care deeply, the weight of those roles drains the current of attraction, leaving only the instinct to flee. But the woman who has reclaimed her power knows a different path. She does not voice threats cloaked in jokes, nor prophecies cloaked in insecurity, nor ownership cloaked in affection. She trusts the silence. She trusts herself. She trusts that love, to endure, must be chosen in freedom, not bound by fear. Her essence speaks not through clinging words but through the quiet confidence of presence. This is the paradox that defines true magnetism: when she does not demand to be his forever, he longs to make her so. When she does not insist he could not live without her, there is a threshold every woman must eventually cross: the understanding that intimacy is not sustained by words of desperation, but by the energy of self-possession. After sex, when the psyche is most exposed, careless phrases betray her shadows: fears of abandonment, cravings for permanence, wounds that whisper of unworthiness. Each time such words slip from her lips, they hand her power to him, asking him to be the guardian of her wholeness. And though he may care, no man can carry the weight of a soul that refuses to carry itself. His unconscious does not recoil from her body, but from the burden of her projection. The woman who awakens to this truth steps into a deeper archetype. She becomes not the maiden pleading for reassurance, nor the mother binding with obligation, but the sovereign, the woman who holds her worth in her own hands. She understands Jung's teaching that individuation is the path to wholeness, and she no longer seeks that wholeness outside herself. After intimacy, she does not rush to fill the silence with chains disguised as love. She lets the silence breathe, trusting it to carry its own power. In that silence, he feels not pressure, but safety. He senses her mystery, her restraint, her refusal to beg for guarantees. And it is precisely this restraint that becomes magnetic. For the masculine spirit, weary of demands, craves the rare sanctuary where he is free to choose. When she does not cling, he feels drawn. When she does not demand, he feels compelled to give. When she does not bind, he feels inspired to remain. This is the paradox of true attraction: what she releases returns with greater devotion, what she grasps dissolves. She no longer utters phrases of possession or fear. She knows her worth is not conditional on his promises, her joy is not reliant on his constancy, her essence is not diminished if he withdraws. And because she knows this, she embodies a radiant calm. In her presence, he finds not only passion but peace, not only desire but devotion. For he senses what is rarest of all, a woman who loves without losing herself. This is the culmination of shadow work, the integration of fear into strength, the alchemy of wounds into wisdom. She becomes untouchable, not because she hardens, but because she softens without surrendering her sovereignty. Her love is no longer a plea but a choice, no longer a demand but a gift. And in this stance, she discovers the greatest secret of attraction: a man does not stay because he is bound. He stays because, in her presence, he is free. So let the silence after passion speak louder than fear. Let it carry the weight of self-knowing, the fragrance of sovereignty, the power of a soul that has completed itself. For when the feminine embodies this truth, she does not chase, she does not beg, she does not cling. She simply radiates, and in that radiance, he is compelled to remain, not as prisoner, but as devotee. The woman who knows her worth doesn't chase, she chooses.